The cold steel of the armored fighting vehicle radiated the deep chill of the pre-dawn desert, a pervasive, cutting temperature that seemed to strip warmth directly from the bone. This was the environment of the assembly area, stretched along the ragged, unforgiving border between Saudi Arabia and the nascent front of the Iraqi desert frontier. The air was thick, not just with the exhaust fumes of thousands of idling engines, but with the palpable tension of men waiting for the order that would unleash the greatest armored maneuver since the Second World War. Operation Desert Storm, a campaign forged in high-tech surgical precision, was about to enter its ground phase, the brutal, high-velocity 100-hour war. But even the most meticulous military operation, especially one executed at blinding speed across featureless terrain, generates its own shadow archive of unsolvable puzzles. The sheer velocity of the ground offensive, dubbed the left hook, was a historical achievement, a devastating sweep that rendered the Iraqi defense doctrine instantly obsolete. That speed, however, masked lapses, chaotic moments, and enduring questions. Among the most unsettling of these cold cases are the 5 specific reconnaissance vehicles, scout platforms integral to the spear tip of the advance, that simply ceased to exist. These scout vehicles were the eyes and ears of Task Force Ripper, the forward element dedicated to punching through the hostile frontier and opening the path for the heavy armor that followed. They were specialized tools, often modified high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, or purpose-built light armored vehicles, stripped down for speed and outfitted with cutting-edge thermal optics and communication arrays. They were low-slung, agile, and meant to avoid contact, tasting the battlefield ahead of the massive, grinding columns of the M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks. Their mission profile demanded invisibility and hyper-awareness. Their vulnerability was an inherent trade-off for their critical role. The terrain they swept across offered little comfort. It was a hostile expanse of hard-packed gypsum, interspersed with shifting, pale yellow dunes that concealed sudden, treacherous drops. Shallow, ancient wadis, dry riverbeds carved by infrequent, violent flash floods, crisscrossed the landscape, offering limited cover, but also acting as channels for unexpected concentrations of enemy fire. The atmosphere itself seemed designed to defeat optical tracking. The desert air, cold in the darkness, warmed rapidly after sunrise, generating mirages that danced and warped the horizon, confusing even the most sophisticated targeting systems. It was into this desolate and dynamic theater that the 5 Recon teams vanished. They disappeared during the critical push, navigating the most vulnerable sectors of the advance. The common thread uniting these 5 losses was not proximity. They were separated geographically, but the identical frustrating result of the subsequent searches, a complete absence of the expected metallic signature of a major combat kill. The last communications received from these teams were terse, clipped reports over encrypted channels. Typically, they involved positional coordinates, observations of sporadic distant artillery impacts, and crucially, complaints about the rapidly deteriorating weather conditions. The Gulf War was plagued by unpredictable and violent silt storms, not the majestic, rolling orange clouds of Hollywood mythology, but rather thick, choking tempests of pulverized, abrasive dust that reduced visual range to mere yards. This fine loess infiltrated everything, coating the interiors of vehicle cabs, grinding the mechanisms of weaponry, and rendering thermal optics nearly useless by saturating the air with particulates. It was amidst one of these blinding, choking storms, a yellowish-gray veil drawn across the battlefield, that the signals abruptly ceased. Not a cry for help, not a panicked report of ambush, but silence. Initial military tracking systems, relying on intermittent satellite uplinks and line-of-sight relays, registered the last known positions, marking them as static, comms failure. This was not an uncommon event in the first hours of the offensive. What set these 5 cases apart was the failure to re-establish contact after the storms cleared, and the subsequent failure of the recovery elements to find the chassis. When the main assault columns of Task Force Ripper surged past the designated areas, the immediate focus was on maintaining momentum. Only hours later, once the operational tempo permitted, did dedicated Combat Recovery and Battle Damage Assessment (BDA) teams swing back to investigate the anomalies. These teams were navigating a battlefield instantly transformed, littered with destroyed Iraqi armor, unexploded ordnance, and the cold residue of immense violence. The search teams, moving slowly across the hard-packed sand, often guided by GPS coordinates, cross-referenced with faint topographical data, found frustratingly similar scenes. They located scattered debris, a piece of webbing, an expended smoke grenade canister, perhaps a damaged radio handset. In several instances, they identified the unmistakable tread patterns of the Recon vehicle's tires, distinct from the broad, heavy tracks of the Abrams tanks. These tracks, often shallow imprints in the desert crust, simply terminated. They did not lead to a crater, nor to an overturned smoking hulk. They stopped, as if the vehicle had been airlifted away or had dissolved directly into the sand. The air above these termination points was cold, the silence profound, a stark contrast to the distant rumble of the ongoing war. This uniform lack of wreckage forms the core of the first enduring mystery, the suspected instant obliteration. This theory posits that the disappearance was caused by overwhelming, concentrated Iraqi artillery fire, a barrage achieving a level of saturation and destructive force so absolute that no substantial metallic signature remained. The question immediately arises: how could a vehicle, however lightweight, be so thoroughly vaporized? The Iraqi military, relying heavily on Soviet doctrine, possessed a formidable arsenal of heavy tube artillery and rocket systems. They employed vast batteries of 152mm and 203mm howitzers, and perhaps more significantly, the BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launcher systems. The Grad, in particular, was notorious not for its precision, but for its ability to deliver a massive volume of explosive ordnance across a wide area in a matter of seconds. A battery of Grad launchers could instantaneously blanket a target zone with hundreds of high-explosive fragmentation, HE-frag warheads. If one of these reconnaissance teams had inadvertently driven into the target zone of a desperate, final Iraqi defensive fire mission, the result could have been catastrophic. A scout platform, especially if it was a modified Humvee with only rudimentary armor plating, is inherently fragile. A direct hit from a 152mm round is devastating, capable of flipping and disintegrating a heavier vehicle. Multiple simultaneous impacts, especially if the rounds detonated directly above or slightly below the thin hull, could theoretically achieve near-total destruction. The forensic challenge here is determining what near-total destruction truly entails. While high explosives turn metal to shrapnel and dust, some significant wreckage always remains. The engine block, the transmission housing, the heavy internal structure of the turret ring. Yet, the BDA teams found no engine blocks, no heavy axles, nothing that required specialized recovery gear to lift. Proponents of the obliteration theory suggest the specific conditions of the attack must have been uniquely conducive to minimal debris. Perhaps the vehicles were struck while already compromised, stalled, or maneuvering at high speed, causing secondary destruction upon impact. The energy released by a concentrated artillery strike on an aluminum-heavy vehicle, common in some scout designs, might scatter the resultant pieces across miles of desert, small enough to be obscured by the initial dust and the subsequent wind action. The heat generated by such an explosion is immense, capable of fusing glass and vaporizing lubricants, but dissolving steel into nothingness requires an extraordinary level of energy delivery over a sustained period, which is inconsistent with typical artillery impacts. However, in the high-stress, low-visibility environment of the 100-hour push, A definitive crater or concentrated debris field was the expectation. Its absence remains the mystery. Was it truly vaporization, or simply dispersal, so thorough it imitated non-existence? The lingering scent of burnt explosives and diesel fuel was reported at one site, fading quickly in the cold desert wind, but the physical evidence of the kill was missing. This leads directly into the second, highly controversial theory. The absence of the hulking, mangled chassis was the result of a sophisticated, covert cleanup operation. This hypothesis removes the onus of the destruction from the enemy and places it, unsettlingly, on specialized U.S. or coalition recovery units. Why would highly trained personnel meticulously erase the footprint of lost American vehicles? The answer lies in the highly sensitive nature of the equipment these reconnaissance vehicles carried. In 1991, the technological gap between the coalition forces and the Iraqi military, supplied primarily by older Soviet models, was immense. The advantage lay in electronic warfare, advanced communication systems, and most critically, thermal imaging and targeting arrays. The sensors mounted on these scout platforms were the eyes of the future battlefield. Uncooled thermal sights, high-resolution optical magnifiers, and secure frequency-hopping radios. If these systems were captured intact, or even partially intact, they represented a massive intelligence coup for adversaries seeking to understand and potentially counter Western military technology. If a vehicle was damaged, but the sensitive electronic packages were still salvageable by the enemy, standard military doctrine mandates that the asset must be denied to the adversary. This denial typically involves airstrikes to destroy the carcass or demolition charges placed by ground troops. But what if the vehicle was disabled, perhaps bogged down in soft sand, or slightly damaged by near-miss shell fire, and the crew was incapacitated or forced to evacuate, leaving the vehicle essentially intact but strategically abandoned? In the chaotic sweep of the ground offensive, immediate destruction might not have been possible. A specialized recovery unit, operating under the utmost secrecy, might have been tasked with sweeping behind the main line of advance, specifically targeting disabled or abandoned high-value assets. Imagine the scene. A small, heavily armed team arrives at the site. The dust storm has passed, leaving a stillness interrupted only by the wind whistling over the lip of a wadi. The scout vehicle is present, perhaps tipped on its side or simply disabled mechanically. The priority is not merely to destroy it, but to recover or thoroughly neutralize the sensitive equipment. If the technology could be rapidly stripped out, the optics turret disconnected, the circuit boards pulled, the main computer memory erased, the empty hull then becomes a problem. To leave the hull, even empty, still announces a loss and invites curious investigation. A full covert cleanup operation would involve not just stripping the sensitive electronics, but also physically removing the chassis itself. While moving a disabled, several-ton vehicle across rough desert is a logistical challenge, specialized heavy equipment transporters, or HETs, or recovery vehicles were deployed for this very purpose. The cleanup theory suggests the vehicle was winched onto a flatbed, concealed under tarpaulins, and removed from the theater of operations entirely, perhaps transported back to a secure rear area for detailed analysis or disposal. The removal would be executed with meticulous care, the tracks of the recovery vehicle erased, and the site returned to the appearance of undisturbed desert. This explains the frustratingly clean termination of the original tire tracks. They simply vanish because the vehicle was lifted vertically or towed away by a different, controlled route. However, the cost and complexity of such an operation, involving the removal of 5 separate hulks without leaving bureaucratic or physical trace, strains credibility. Such extreme secrecy usually attends only the loss of the most advanced stealth platforms or nuclear materials. Yet, the physical evidence, the lack of wreckage, strongly supports the notion that the vehicles were not destroyed in place by high explosives, but were physically removed. The third, more chilling possibility moves the focus back toward the enemy and centers on the trophy room hypothesis. This suggests that the vehicles were captured relatively intact and driven deep into Iraq, their advanced targeting arrays now disassembled in secret bunkers far from the theater of operations. This scenario requires a specific alignment of events. The vehicles must have been disabled non-catastrophically, perhaps by an ambush that wounded or killed the crew without damaging the critical systems, or by a simple mechanical breakdown during the period of zero visibility. In the confusion of the swift advance, small pockets of Iraqi defenders, isolated and desperate, might have encountered the stationary or struggling recon teams. Given the lightweight armor, a quick, brutal firefight could have neutralized the crew. Realizing the immense intelligence value of the sophisticated Western hardware, the thermal sights that could pierce the desert night, the GPS navigation systems, still relatively new and restricted technology, the decision could have been made to salvage the platform. Moving a high-tech Western vehicle across the battlefield required expertise and resources that Iraqi units were rapidly losing. Yet, necessity breeds invention. Using Iraqi T-55 recovery vehicles, or even specialized heavy trucks commandeered from civilian infrastructure, the vehicles could have been towed. They would have been driven east, away from the advancing coalition forces, hidden during the day in deep wadis or among civilian structures, and moved only under the cover of night. The fate of the crews in this scenario is grim. They would either have been instantly executed, leaving no witnesses, or, if captured, transported alongside the vehicles for interrogation. The intelligence value of the systems would have been paramount. Imagine the moment of discovery in a deep bunker near Baghdad, or perhaps far to the north, beyond the reach of the 100-hour offensive. Iraqi engineers dismantling the optic heads, reverse engineering the frequency hopping protocols of the radios, probing the internal architecture of the computers. The trophy room hypothesis is difficult to disprove because the vehicles, if successfully moved deep into enemy territory, would be nearly impossible to locate in the post-war chaos and sanctions regime. They would not be listed in official surrender tallies or identified during UN inspections. They would exist only as components, scattered across various intelligence and R&D centers, silent artifacts of a fleeting battlefield encounter. The technology transfer would be complete, the original hulks perhaps eventually scuttled in a remote location once their components were harvested. If this theory holds, the ultimate secret is not what happened to the armor, but what secrets the armor gave up. Did a critical piece of fire control technology end up in the hands of a non-coalition power during the complex geopolitical aftermath of 1991? This possibility remains a persistent, unsettling undercurrent in military intelligence circles. The fourth, and perhaps darkest explanation, revisits a constant, tragic hazard of modern warfare: catastrophic friendly fire, or blue on blue. This suggests a tragic mistake in the chaotic confusion, where an American attack aircraft, or less likely, an adjacent friendly armor column, misidentified the low-profile scouts as retreating enemy armor. The ground war in 1991 was fought at an unprecedented tempo, characterized by long, high-speed movements in unfamiliar territory. Despite advances in identification friend or foe, IFF systems, and the deployment of thermal imaging capable of distinguishing friend from foe, the chaos inherent in a swift maneuver often overrides technology. The scout vehicles, by necessity, were often operating far ahead of the main line of troops, creating a complex and confusing forward edge of the battle area. If an air support element, say an A-10 Warthog or an AH-64 Apache attack helicopter, was vectored onto a target area during one of the blinding silt storms, the potential for error skyrockets. A low-profile reconnaissance vehicle, moving rapidly or stationary, could easily be misidentified, especially if its IIF transponder was malfunctioning due to battle damage, power failure, or simply being obscured by the heavy dust. To a pilot relying on a zoomed-in thermal view, a quick-moving shape could look exactly like an Iraqi command vehicle or a Soviet-designed reconnaissance platform. Friendly fire incidents, even non-fatal ones, were tragically common in Desert Storm. The combination of high speed, low visibility, and fatigue created an environment ripe for error. Kinetic energy defined, a high-speed capture of the GAU Avenger, launching 30mm depleted uranium rounds into the blinding desert light. The hardened steel of the abandoned hull bears the brutal, permanent scars of catastrophic armor penetration. These massive, warped entry holes stand as silent testament to the violence of the final engagement. The spot where the wreckage was supposed to be yielded only frustrating silence and undisturbed sand under his tape. The operational details remain classified, but the commander's intense gaze reveals the stakes of the mission. The perimeter was secured at first light, as heavy transports carrying their crucial tarped cargo executed a highly coordinated and silent desert departure. Buried in the archive dust, the fragile manila folder marked blue on blue still radiated the danger of sensitive, reclassified truth. The mechanical claw makes its final drop into the desert grave. All trace of the incident, reduced to unrecognizable metal dust, is now erased. The infrared sweep clearly defined the path across the desert, but here, the ghostly tracks terminate and dissolve into an undifferentiated patch of cold, empty sand. A testament to geological time, these dramatic banks tell the story of powerful erosion, a silent record of the flash flood's fury. The gale had weaponized the desert floor. Every grain of silica was propelled horizontally, blurring into a destructive stream of light and dust. The desert claimed its prize long ago. Only the defiant, rusted turret remains above the pale, engulfing tide of sand. 30 years of silence have passed since this hulk surrendered to the dune's relentless erosion. 3 meters of sediment gave way to steel. The intact, dark green hull of a buried armored vehicle is revealed during the excavation. The desert's tight armor, a dark, smooth mosaic of interlocking stones forming an impenetrable crust. This flawless surface hides the loose, fine sand that rests just millimeters below. This isn't data, it's just geological noise. The chaotic interference pattern rendered any attempt at object detection utterly futile. Against this endless, trackless expanse, the search for anything seemed an act of profound loneliness. The massive blade surges forward, burying the faint remnants of scattered military wreckage under tons of desert sand. This powerful machine is relentlessly clearing the path for the future. The heavy, melancholic air hung low, a curtain of fine grit and lingering smoke that refused to lift from the abandoned path. Decades of static and dust challenged the eye, linking the crucial, faded satellite imagery directly to the cryptic, archaic radio transcript. The Silicon Age yields to the hourglass as the desert reclaims its domain around the silent eye of surveillance. The scout platforms were crucial links in the informational chain. Their loss meant temporary blindness for the heavy tank columns they preceded, forcing the entire task force to slow down, if only for cautious moments, until replacement eyes could be moved forward. This tactical impact underscored their importance and intensified the urgency of the initial search. The enduring visual of the search parties remains evocative. The low sun casting long, pale shadows across the dunes, the cold, metallic tang of the lingering cordite smell, and the sight of men kneeling in the sand, carefully examining faint tire tracks that led nowhere. They were looking for the glint of heavy steel, the catastrophic signatures of high explosives, but finding only the pristine, wind-swept surface of the desert, preserving a secret that the sands have yet to relinquish. The Desert Storm campaign was celebrated for its efficiency and minimal losses, But the fate of these 5 specialized vehicles serves as a grim reminder that even in the most technologically advanced conflicts, the battlefield reserves the right to swallow its casualties whole, leaving behind only conjecture and the ghostly termination of a tire track in the dust. The desert holds these metallic secrets, silent testaments to the moment the war swept over them, sealing their fate beneath the shifting layers of pale yellow earth. The questions persist, whispered in the cold, clear air above the silent wadis. Were they vaporized by Russian steel, stolen by Iraqi intelligence, accidentally destroyed by their own side, or simply waiting, perfectly preserved, for the slow, relentless hand of archaeology to uncover the truth?